Welcome to episode 20 in our series on Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto's The Way of God. And we are about to begin the fourth section of this book, which deals in the concept of serving God. And in this episode, we're going to do two chapters, the first two chapters. The first chapter is an introductory section describing the various types of service that one can do for God. And in the second chapter, it's going to deal with the study of the Torah and how important it is and how valuable this holy book is to us as a guidebook. And not only that, how it is an immediate connection to God and how it has an influence both ways, the study of it. Even just the reading of it has a metaphysical effect that the Ramchal is going to describe. So let's start with chapter 1, this classification of areas of divine service. So the Ramchal begins. Serving God involves two elements, study and observance. Observances are divided into four categories: those that are continuous and constant, those that are performed once a day or a fixed number of times per day, those that are periodic, those that are occasional or circumstantial. Continuous observances are those which are incumbent upon man at all times, such as the love and fear of God. Service which is obligatory on a daily basis is sometimes required once, twice, or a few times a day. The daily offerings were an example of this category whilst the temple stood. Today, examples of daily observances include the recital of the Shema, which we do twice a day, and prayer services 3 times a day. Periodic observance includes matters that must be observed at specific times, such as Shabbos observance and the service associated with the holy days. Circumstantial observances are those which depend on events and situations. Thus, for example, one can fulfill the commandment of separating the dough offering, or challah, only when one bakes. Similarly, tithes, ma'aseh, can be separated only when one eats produce grown in the land of Israel. Likewise, the commandment to redeem one's firstborn son cannot be fulfilled lacking the actual birth. There are many such commandments. All 4 categories of observances are further divided into 2 general groups, one consisting of what a person is required to do and the other of what he is forbidden to do. These 2 groupings are generally referred to as positive versus negative commandments, reflecting the verse from Tehillim 34 verse 15, depart from evil and do good. However, the general goal of observances and study was explained earlier in part 1 chapter 4. That is, serving God is the way that man becomes directed to God and draws himself near to him and clings to him. Through the different mechanisms that God has ordained for doing so, man must strive to remove every obstacle, every element of evil that is associated with his base physical nature and the material world, urging himself in God's direction until he attaches to God and partakes of God's perfection. This is all that God desires of man, and this is the only reason that man was created, as mentioned earlier. The details and mechanics of these matters involve the very structure of the world and mankind, and all the varying attributes of each, for these observances are given to man so that he can perfect himself and perfect all of creation at the same time, its entire structure and every component, root and branch. We will now discuss certain particular observances, ones which pertain to every time and place. So that concludes the first chapter, and now we'll start the second chapter, which is entitled Study of the Torah. So the Ramchal begins. The study of the Torah is an absolutely necessary matter, for without it, one cannot do what the Torah commands, because if a person does not know what he is supposed to do, how can he do it? In addition, however, Torah study in its own right is an end in itself, for it plays a very large role in bringing man to perfection. As we mentioned briefly earlier, let us now elaborate. Of all the influences that God causes to emanate from him for the sake of his creations, one is higher than all the others, being more dear and precious than anything else that God created. This influence is the closest thing to God himself that can be found in creation, its loftiness and excellence resembling God's own to some degree. Through this influence, God enables creations to actually partake of some of his glory and perfection. This influence, however, was bound by God to yet another creation, the Torah, which God designed specifically to carry this influence to the physical world. In practice, the influence arrives by means of two activities, namely the speaking and understanding of the words of Torah. As mentioned previously, God chose a particular combination of words and sayings to constitute the Torah, which consists of the 5 books, on a lower level, the prophets or Nevi'im, and writing, Kesubim. God then bound the aforementioned influence to the words of these books in such a way that when a person actually pronounces the words of Torah, the influence is transmitted to him. This is therefore the concept of involvement in the Torah. The simple recitation of these books can have a great effect if done under conditions that will be discussed shortly. The same is true of comprehension. Through the content of these words' true meaning, the influence is transmitted to the one who comprehends them. Just as in the case of all other influences and concepts in creation, this influence has many degrees. The effects of both the recitation and the comprehension are thus differentiated as deemed proper by the highest wisdom. Each different recitation therefore transmits a particular degree of this influence. The same is true of comprehension. There is no element of Torah study, however, that does not transmit some degree of this highest influence, as long as the necessary conditions are fulfilled. It is obvious that the higher the level of comprehension, the higher will be the corresponding influence derived through it. An individual who understands only the language of a biblical passage is therefore not equal to one who understands its meaning. Likewise, one who understands only its superficial meaning is not the same as one who delves more deeply. Furthermore, even when one does go into the deeper meaning, the more he delves, the higher will be his level. It is an aspect of God's love, however, that even the lowest level of comprehension can transmit a degree of this influence. Everyone who comprehends any element of the Torah can thus benefit from this great influence, merely as a result of what is bound together with such comprehension. The same is true of one who does not understand the words at all, but only reads them. Even this is a means through which some of this influence can be granted. To a greater or lesser extent, virtually every Jew, therefore, has access to this highest influence. One level of the Torah's influence is therefore to reward the effort that people put into it, according to the true measure of that effort. Besides this, however, there is another aspect and level, and that is to rectify creation as a whole. There is no element in all creation that is not rectified through the Torah. Furthermore, each element of the Torah has the ability to perfect some part of creation. An individual who wants to serve his Creator with complete devotion must therefore involve himself in every aspect of the Torah to the best of his ability. Through this, he can take part in the rectification of all creation. Our sages therefore teach us one should divide his study to include 1/3 scripture, 1/3 Mishnah, and 1/3 Gemara. This includes every element of the Torah, and one should divide his study among them until he grasps them all, not omitting anything. The amount of one's study in each area, however, should depend on his own particular nature and situation. This has already been discussed in a separate essay which should be consulted, and he's referring here to his own works, two works, Derech HaShem and Derech Chochmah, both by the Ramchal. And now the Ramchal is going to describe the sublime influence that is dispatched if the Torah is learnt with the correct reverence and respect. This metaphysical effect that is caused by a person's genuine studying and reverence for the Torah. So the Ramchal continues. In order to have its desired effect, study of the Torah must conform to two conditions. These are reverence for the study itself and the constant rectification of one's own deeds. The only reason why the Torah has any power at all is because God bound his most precious influence to it, making it dependent on the Torah. It is for this reason that reciting and comprehending it can transmit this influence. If God had not made it so, then the Torah would be no different from any other educational book involving the various aspects of natural inquiry. These books may contain accurate and valuable information, but they do not incorporate any significance and excellence in the soul of a person who reads, recites, or comprehends them. Books such as these, furthermore, have absolutely no power to rectify creation. The influence of the Torah, however, is a godly thing, as discussed earlier. Not only that, but it is the highest and most important of all the concepts transmitted and conveyed by God to man. Because of this fact, it is imperative that one should have reverence and awe when involved in the Torah. What one is then doing is approaching his God and involving himself in the transmission of the great light from God to himself. The individual involved in the Torah should therefore be abashed by his human lowliness and tremble before God's loftiness. He should rejoice in what he can attain, but even this should be combined with the greatest possible awe. It is all the more important that one not behave frivolously when involved in the Torah, and not show any disrespect for its books or their words. When occupied with the Torah, one must realize before whom he stands. When one fulfills these conditions, then his study of the Torah is as it should be. He can then draw down the influence discussed earlier and incorporate it in himself godly excellence, as well as rectify and illuminate all creation. If this condition is not met, however, then it will not result in any illumination, and reciting words of the Torah will be no different from any other human speech. Reading it will be no different from reading a letter, and thinking about it no different from considering any worldly matter. Quite to the contrary. Such involvement will be considered a misdeed, since this person is approaching the holy without reverence and behaving frivolously while speaking in the presence of his Creator and occupying himself with his holiness. The value of a person's study and the level of the resulting influence therefore vary according to the degree of his reverence and the measure of his respect and attentiveness. The second condition is the rectification of one's deeds. One who wishes to draw down God's influence should be one who is worthy and prepared to do so. If a person defiles himself with sin and guilt, then he divorces himself from his Creator and corrupts himself through the forces of pollution and evil. He places himself in the category regarding which is written, and I quote from Tehillim 50 verse 16. To the wicked God says, "What do you have by speaking my statutes?" Our sages likewise teach us, whoever teaches an unworthy student is like one who commits adultery, casting a stone in the worship of Mercury. I believe this casting a stone in the worship of Mercury was one of these pagan or ungodly practices where they would throw stones at an idol, somehow provoking some sort of imaginary divination or service in their eyes. The Ramchal continues, when a person is unworthy, his study of the Torah will certainly not draw down any of the pre-mentioned influence in any degree whatsoever. Now the Ramchal is going to describe how the recitation of words of the Torah can enlighten and purify even a very wicked person. So this is the effect it can have, and such a purifying effect can be revealed. So the Ramchal continues. Our sages have revealed a very great mystery, however, namely, that if the wicked would only not abandon the study of the Torah, they would ultimately return to God. Even though they do not have the power to transmit anything from God, as discussed previously, the words of the Torah themselves are intrinsically holy. One who consistently involves himself with the Torah therefore constantly receives a small measure of spiritual motivation from it. Even though this is the barest possible shadow of the true illumination, the fact that it is constantly reinforced gives it the power to ultimately overcome a person and make him good again. Our sages thus teach that God said, and I quote, "If they would only have kept my Torah, the light in it would bring them back to the good." It is obvious, however, that this is not true of an individual who involves himself with the Torah scornfully or frivolously. It also does not apply to one who perverts its true meaning. The only time the Torah can have even this benefit is when a person involves himself with it with the same seriousness and intellectual honesty that one should have when studying any other discipline. When a person purifies and sanctifies himself, his study then transmits to him a degree of influence depending on his level of preparation. The more he prepares himself, the greater will be the value and power of his study. We thus find, in the case of some of the earlier sages, that the Torah would surround them with great power and provide them with status and excellence that did not exist in later generations. This was a direct result of their preparation. It is thus said that when Yehonasan ben Uziel studied Torah, any bird flying near him would be burnt. This was a result of the tremendous degree to which the divine presence, or Shekhinah, surrounded him as a result of his study. And that concludes the second chapter on the study of the Torah. And so what can we learn from that? We can learn whatever level we are of observance or religious conviction or religious status. If one wants to generate some sort of metaphysical influence from above, one simply, the minimum one has to do is just make the effort to recite the words of the Torah. It's such a powerful book that even just speaking the words has a direct influence on God, on heaven, and whatever is drawn down by this recitation. Even more so, if we make the efforts to understand what the words are, they have a greater influence backwards and forwards between God and heaven and us. And it seems like the rectification of the world can be effected through this metaphysical book, the Torah. And the next episode, we're going to the Ramchal's going to discuss love and fear of God. And that's chapter 3, and I look forward to that.